Challenger's counting down for a service call 300 miles up. President Reagan scores Congress for activism in foreign affairs. Good morning. This is Reed Collins with the CBS World News Roundup. If it goes as planned, the Space Shuttle Challenger will be climbing skyward 1 hour from now, the heaviest, highest, and most ambitious mission of them all. Judy Muller reports from the Kennedy Space Center.
Challenger's 5 crew members are strapped into their seats, waiting now for liftoff in less than an hour. A liftoff that will eventually take them higher than any shuttle crew has ever flown before. The reason? Challenger must get within parking distance of a disabled Solar Max satellite, now wobbling in orbit 305 miles up. The primary mission of this 11th shuttle flight is to repair that satellite in space so that Solar Max can get on with its business of studying solar flares. NASA officials shortened the so-called launch window this morning by a little over a minute for an interesting reason.
If we launched any later than 7 minutes and 45 seconds after 8:58, we would approach the Soyuz Soviet space station too closely.
There are a total of 5 Soviet cosmonauts on the Salyut 7 space station, along with an Indian colleague. When the 5 Americans get into orbit, there will be a record 11 men in space at the same time. Judy Muller, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
A coup in Cameroon this morning. The capital of that African nation, Yaoundé, rang with gunfire. The radio played martial music, and the borders and airports were closed.
Challenger's crew now sits strapped in its seats, set for the highest space shuttle flight in history.
Crip, this launch team is real proud to turn Challenger over to you again. I understand if you sit in that seat a few more times, we're going to have to take it out and bronze it and put it in your living room.
Thank you much, Bob. It's always a pleasure working with the Kennedy launch team. They do a superb job.
Thank you very much. We'll be watching for your efforts this week with a lot of interest, and we can't wait to get you back in Florida next week.
Bob Crippen there, flying on his 3rd space shuttle mission this time. The only unexpected change in plans this morning comes at an emergency landing site. The weather is bad over at Edwards Air Force Base in California, so if something goes wrong and the shuttle has to go around the Earth once and return home, the landing site will be at White Sands in New Mexico. No big problem there. The weather at the Cape has been better than expected. Astronaut John Young has been flying his training aircraft on test landings, checking the Cape weather. All is set for a launch at 7:58 a.m. Houston time. Our live coverage, Chris Peterson will be along with me coming up 10 minutes until 8 this morning on the Morning Report, right here on KTRH. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
The flight of the Shuttle Challenger. I'm Judy Muller, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. We are just minutes away from yet another launch of the shuttle, the 11th in the series, the 5th for Challenger. In a sense, all previous flights have been laying the groundwork for this one, or should we say space work. The main mission for Challenger's crew is to track down an ailing satellite over 300 miles high, send out a free-flying astronaut to dock with it, bring the satellite back into the shuttle's cargo bay, repair it, and return it to space. The in-space repair of satellites is an important goal for the entire shuttle program, and so this flight is a critical test. Now, in order to get to the point where the shuttle can rendezvous with that satellite, the launch is going to be a little different this time. This flight, called 41C, will be the first to use what's called a direct insertion ascent technique that will take the Challenger up to about 288 miles. Just 1 burn of the orbital maneuvering rockets will be needed rather than the usual 2 to place the craft into its final orbit about 299 miles up. That is higher than any shuttle has flown before. And then through a series of maneuvers, the crew will eventually push Challenger still higher by several miles, parking, if you will, about 300 feet away from that satellite. And considering all that space out in space, that is no small accomplishment. The voice of launch control this morning is Hugh Harris, and he's been chatting away now about what a perfect launch countdown this has been.
1 minute, 30 seconds and counting.
T-minus.
Everything going smoothly as we look forward to liftoff of 41C.
One of the smoothest countdowns so far, they say. If all goes well with this 6-day mission, it will end with a landing back here at the Cape Kennedy Space Center on the same runway used for the first time on the last flight. My colleague Spencer Allen has been high atop the vehicle assembly building this morning, where there's not only a great view of the launch site, but of that landing strip as well. We had some problem with wind shears yesterday. Spence, what's the latest on the high winds aloft?
It's much better today, Judy. Yesterday, the winds were 68 knots at 16,000 feet, but today they're down to 45 knots, and that's within acceptable levels. Also up at 39,000 feet, it's 111 knots, but that is still considered acceptable.
How's the weather look from up there?
Beautiful, just beautiful. A slight bit of haze on the horizon here. Otherwise, the visibility is 7 miles and a gentle wind out of the west-northwest.
It's a good view from down here on the ground as well. Not a cloud in the sky. Winds hardly rippling the flag down here, and we're very, very close to launch now, less than 30 seconds away. And everything really looks very smooth so far. Let's listen now to Hugh Harris as he begins the countdown
13,
for liftoff.
12, 11, 10. We are go for main engine start. 8,
Main
7,
engine start.
6,
5, 4, 3. Main engine start. We have ignition.
And liftoff.
And liftoff. Challenger leaping away from its earthbound perch, soaring literally to new heights, flying inexorably towards a height that a shuttle has never flown to before. A beautiful, bright orange against a bright blue Florida sky. You can hear the rumble behind us, shaking the ground under us, rattling the windows on the building we're in. Powerful thrust provided, of course, by 2 solid rocket boosters, as well as the 3 main engines, a giant firecracker.
Throttles down to 60.
Turning over now, 100-degree rollover, putting the astronauts in a head-down position. That, of course, is what is supposed to happen. Getting them into the proper position to get finally up to their orbit. Soaring off into space. You can still see a giant plume of smoke trailing up, and still the red-orange flame trailing behind the orbiter. A brilliant, brilliant liftoff.
Go at throttle up.
Go at throttle up. Racing up to an orbital highway where it will repair a disabled satellite, very much like a tow truck dispatched to help a disabled car. Somehow that metaphor doesn't work very well when you see the spectacle of this launch. No tow truck ever left a service station quite like this.
Continues nominal. APU speeds, temperatures, and pressures all look good. Velocity 4,000 feet per second.
Velocity 4,000 feet per second.
Miles, distance downrange.
She is traveling.
11 nautical miles.
Pretty soon reaching maximum dynamic pressure.
Standing by for chamber pressure call, which will be the precursor of solid motor separation.
All the main engines will be throttled up to 104%. The crew feeling the effects of the acceleration. At the strongest point, the force is at 3 Gs, meaning they feel about 3 times the gravity of pressure they would feel on Earth. We're waiting for rocket booster separation. You just heard that.
Separation of the solid rocket motors.
The 2 solid rocket boosters falling away from the craft. We can see that on the long-range optics that NASA provides. Those solid rocket boosters, of course, will fall into the ocean, the Atlantic here, where there's a convoy of ships waiting to pick them up. They'll be reused again. As I said, at the strongest point of acceleration, the astronauts feel about 3 Gs. That's really less than you'd feel on your average roller coaster ride. And this trip is probably a lot smoother. It certainly looks that way this morning as Challenger continues to thrust its way into space. Still a plume of smoke trailing behind. At this point, if anything did go wrong with 1 or more of the main engines, the shuttle could still return here for a landing, and we can still see the shuttle on the long-range optics, no longer with the naked eye, even though it is a brilliantly clear morning here in Florida. Again, we did luck out. The high winds reduced overnight. They had terrible wind shears here yesterday, and as one NASA official said, wind shears, like any other aircraft, can create quite a problem. It creates an instantaneous attack on the craft. But those did, fortunately, die down, and we had no problems this morning. The weather couldn't have been more cooperative. Again, this launch different from past launches because of something they call direct insertion ascent, which is just NASA-ese for explaining that the shuttle is going higher this time. The reason of satellite on Sunday.
3 minutes, 50 seconds. Engine performance, APU performance, fuel cell performance, all look very good.
Everything looking very good, as you heard Mission Control say. Mission Control has now taken over in Houston as soon as the orbiter clears the tower. So you're hearing the voice of Mission Control, which is John Lawrence at this point. The starring role is taken during this mission by the Solar Maximum Mission Satellite, or SolarMax for short. It was launched back in 1980 to study the solar flare activity on the sun. But after about 9 months in space, 3 fuses in that craft's attitude control system failed. That meant the satellite lost its ability to point directly toward the sun. That satellite cost $77 million back then, but like almost everything else, prices have gone up. Today, it would cost $235 million to replace it. That is precisely, of course, why this mission is so important. Repairing the SolarMax in space will cost a mere $48 million, and that is really a tremendous savings.
Velocity 10,000 feet per second, altitude 63 nautical miles, distance downrange 185 nautical miles.
10,000 feet per second. They are really traveling.
Mission elapsed time 5 minutes. 3.5 minutes remaining of main engine time on this ascent.
They have gone past the point where they could return to the Kennedy Space Center. At this point, if anything went wrong, and of course we hope it did not, they would have several alternative emergency landing sites. And again, fortunately, the weather has cleared up at those prime emergency landing sites in Dakar, Senegal. They had a cloud cover earlier today. That has cleared up. The Northrop Air Base has cleared up. Edwards Air Force Base had a cloud cover, but that is not as serious as it once was. So really everything looks perfect. You can't see anything going wrong so far, and of course nothing has gone wrong so far.
5 minutes, 50 seconds, mission elapsed time. Engine performance continues to look good. And
Challenger Houston, single engine TOW capability.
Despite the fact that this is the 11th flight of the shuttle, the crowds still came out today, lining the highways around the Space Center. We talked to a few of those spectators before the launch, and for those people at least, interest in the program had not diminished.
I think it's great, and I'm glad that they could go up and get the experience and the technology that they have already.
I think it's really good to be able to see where our money is going, and it is our money.
To me, it gets more exciting as the more they go along, because it's closer to the point where someone's going to go that's just a passenger, and that's my ultimate goal, is to get on one myself.
Those are a few of the spectators that were around just before launch, and of course they do come out because it is such a wonderful thing to see. And again, this morning the shuttle put on a real show. Brilliant orange and red flame reflected in the river just below the launch site. It was really spectacular. And of course they continue on their way towards main engine cutoff, which comes in just about a minute and a half from now, and then they will go on to orbit. You just heard us in the background, press to MECO, main engine cutoff. So that is going to be coming up soon.
Orbit on one remaining main engine.
The crew will have other things to do as well, of course, during this flight, besides meet up with that satellite. Aboard the Challenger, taking up half the cargo bay, as a matter of fact, is something called the Long Duration Exposure Facility, or LDEF. And as its name implies, it's designed to stay in space for a long time. In this case, 10 months. It will be the largest and heaviest object ever placed in space by the shuttle. It has a 12-sided, 11-ton rack of cosmic experiments. It looks something like a big Rubik's puzzle.
566 nautical miles downrange.
The crew aboard this flight of the Challenger. The commander is Bob Crippen, or Cripp. He's making his third shuttle flight. His pilot, Dick Scobie, is a rookie, as are the 3 mission specialists. George Pinky Nelson is the man who will fly out to meet with SolarMax. He says he's had his nickname ever since he was born. I guess a reference to the way he looked at the time. James Ox Van Hoften, another mission specialist, the tallest astronaut to ever go into space. Ox is 6'4". He's probably wishing right now he had a little more leg room up there. And Terry T.J. Hart, a veteran jet pilot, is the 5th crew member. We should be hearing main engine cutoff any minute now.
Just momentarily now. Okay, we have MECO at about 2658, and I'm up at about 500.
Roger that. Sounds great, Crip.
And so, we have main engine cutoff. Confirmed.
Standing by now to get off the external tank.
The external fuel tank that supplies fuel for liftoff will now break away from the orbiter. The Challenger will then wend its way up higher than ever before.
External tank separation nominal.
External tank separation, and we have that. So, once again, the shuttle is in space for what NASA hopes will be a successful repair mission to show its customers that not only can the shuttle deliver cargo to space, it can fix it once it's there. I'm Judy Muller, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center.
For main engine start, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start, 3, 2, 1. Solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Challenger and the first flight to repair a satellite in space. We have cleared the tower.
This is Doug Miller, live at the Johnson Space Center. Challenger is now orbiting the Earth on the highest flight in space shuttle history. The first data on the Challenger indicates it's flying in an oblong orbit about 252 miles above the Earth, at its highest 31 miles at its lowest. That's the awkward orbit necessary to save the crippled Solar Max satellite on Sunday. Just a couple of minutes from now, about 10 minutes from now, in fact, the Challenger crew will fire up the shuttle's big maneuvering engines to kick that orbit even higher. Later this morning, Challenger's payload bay doors will be opened up, exposing the biggest cargo ever carried aboard the shuttle, the long-duration exposure facility, the satellite that will be left in space and retrieved on a future shuttle flight. This shuttle flight, though, the first satellite rescue mission in history, is off on the most daring shuttle mission ever. Reporting live from the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
CBS News, I'm Christopher Glenn. The Space Shuttle Challenger is aloft once more, carrying 5 astronauts on the 11th mission of the shuttle series. Judy Muller is at the Kennedy Space Center.
Just minutes ago, the crew aboard the Challenger fired the orbital maneuvering rockets in what's known as an Ohms burn to take the spaceship to its highest orbit ever, more than 290 miles up. A few more maneuverings will eventually place it in position to park near the disabled Solar Max satellite. On Sunday, astronaut Pinky Nelson will don a special backpack and fly out to the Solar Max and stabilize it. Then the craft's robot arm will pluck it out of the sky and place it in the cargo bay for repairs. But before that critical test, the crew must clear the cargo bay of the 11-ton platform called LDEF, an orbiting tray of experiments that will stay in space for almost a year. Also aboard this flight, some 3,000 honeybees, a student experiment designed to see what kind of honeycomb bees will build in zero gravity. Those bees located in a very secure box on the middeck. Judy Muller, CBS News at the Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
CBS News, this is Doug Poling. President Reagan Challenger and its 5 crewmen were launched successfully from Cape Canaveral this morning. The skies are getting crowded these days, and for today's launch, the liftoff time window was shortened so the Challenger would not come too close to an orbiting Soviet Salyut space station. NASA's Tom Utzman explained that.
It was a matter of avoiding getting too close to somebody, so that dictated the closing of the window. It's sort of like hitting the freeways at busy times. You want to know where the other guys are.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union have an agreement not to come within 200 miles of one another's spacecraft. A liftoff any later would have put the shuttle and the space station closer than that. CBS News, this is Doug Poling. Waters this morning of the Space Shuttle Challenger and 5 astronauts. There was a little trouble, as we hear from Peter Van Sant at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
NASA officials say the only problem with this morning's launch was on the ground and not aboard the shuttle Challenger. Officials say the mission operations computer at the Johnson Space Center in Houston had some problems tracking the shuttle. The computer difficulty was discovered during launch, and it prevented mission control from knowing second by second exactly where the shuttle was going. But officials say Challenger is right on course, currently orbiting at an altitude of 252 miles. NASA officials are angry about another problem during launch. 6 private pilots flew into restricted airspace around Cape Canaveral to get a closer look at the shuttle. Each plane was identified, and NASA officials say they will seek to have the pilots' licenses revoked. The planes would have been in the way if the shuttle had to have made an emergency landing. But for now, NASA officials say the mission is going beautifully. Peter Van Sant, CBS News, Houston.
The clear
clearest day in memory at Cape Canaveral this morning allowed spectacular picture taking of the Challenger launch. 2 minutes before 9 local time, the orbiter roared off the pad with 5 crewmen and a 22,000-pound satellite aboard. Their goal is to first deploy that huge spacecraft and then try to capture and repair the ailing Solar Maximum satellite. The astronauts have spent most of the day since launch simply turning on the equipment in the Challenger. They'll go to sleep around 5:30 this afternoon. Tomorrow, Terry Hart uses the mechanical arm to hoist the big long-duration exposure satellite out of the cargo bay and set it in space. Then a spacewalk Sunday, the first of 2, to attempt to repair that $400 million Solar Max satellite. Chris Peterson, KTRH News, live at the Johnson Space Center.
CBS News, I'm Douglas Edwards. President...
It all started as so many missions have, a clear morning at Cape Canaveral, Florida.
3, 2, 1, solid motor ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Challenger and the first flight to repair a satellite in space. We have cleared the tower.
Once in orbit, astronaut Bob Crippen reported to Mission Control here at Johnson that his crew was feeling fine and was busy turning on the massive amounts of equipment on board the spacecraft. The astronauts are due to fall asleep around 5:30 today, but with 4 rookies on the mission, much of the sleep period will be taken up with picture taking and long stares out the window. Tomorrow, the crew goes to work, with mission specialist Terry Hart using the mechanical arm to place the huge long-duration exposure satellite in orbit. Then all eyes will shift to Sunday, when astronauts George Nelson and Jim Van Hoften will use the backpacks to begin repair efforts on the broken Solar Maximum satellite. In the meantime, the astronauts continue to circle the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour from a distance of nearly 300 miles. They'll do that for 5 more days. Chris Peterson, KTRH News, live at the Johnson Space Center.
CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski. Shuttle Challenger rose to altitudes it never reached before to prepare for its Sunday mission, the in-space repair of a satellite observatory. Down below on Earth, a movie about space was making its own news. The story from Steve Kindred of station KNUU, Las Vegas.
A Las Vegas odds maker gives even money to the right stuff, the movie about America's early astronauts, to take the top award at Monday night's Oscars. The tearjerker Terms of Endearment is rated 5-2, with the long shot, The Big Chill, and The Dresser rated 11-1. Frontier Hotel handicapper Lenny Del Genio makes Robert Duvall the 3-2 favorite to pick up a Best Actor statuette for his portrayal of a comeback-bound country singer in Tender Mercies. Del Genio says it's a solid choice for Best Actress.
My best bet is Shirley MacLaine for Terms of Endearment. I believe that she's an odds-on favorite, and I would place a small wager for a bottle of Don Perignon and a pizza on her.
In the supporting categories, Del Genio picks Glenn Close in The Big Chill and Sam Shepard in The Right Stuff. The Oscars will be telecast from Los Angeles Monday night. Steve Kindred for CBS News, Las Vegas.
The launch was perfect, but NASA was a little apprehensive pre-flight because a new launch method was being used. The main engines on the Challenger were set to run at 104% of rated power for a slightly longer duration than usual. The reason is that Challenger had to go to a higher orbit than any other shuttle mission in order to catch up with that broken satellite. Communicator John Blaha in Mission Control told Commander Bob Crippen the launch worked well.
You guys really look good going up the hill this morning.
Yeah, it was a nice day for a launch. Yeah, we could just handle that kind of stuff on 1 entry.
Crippen won't have to worry about the landing until Wednesday morning. In the meantime, the astronauts have turned their attention to the objectives of this mission: repair the Solar Maximum satellite already in orbit and deploy a 22,000-pound satellite that rode up in the Challenger's payload bay today. That deployment is set for tomorrow morning, with mission specialist Terry Hart using the mechanical arm to accomplish that. The Solar Max repair starts Sunday, although technically it actually started at launch. The broken satellite is currently in an orbit about 300 miles up, and it's a complicated task to launch a spacecraft from the ground and get it close to another object already in space. But through a long series of computer-generated maneuvers, Crippen and pilot Dick Scobie have been slowly bringing the orbiter closer to Solar Max. When they complete the rendezvous Sunday, mission specialist George Nelson, nicknamed Pinky, will use one of those Buck Rogers backpacks to fly over to the satellite and physically attach himself to it. The rookie astronaut may have a dangerous and exciting job in front of him, but today he was having fun with mission control.
Tell you, John, if you're looking for something fun to do, you ought to try this sometime.
Roger that, Pink. I'm looking forward to the flight.
Nelson will be joined in the satellite repair effort by Jim Van Hoften. Ox, as he is known, will ride the end of the mechanical arm like a cherry picker to perform the electronic repair Solar Max is needing. A second spacewalk is slated for Tuesday to complete the overhaul and redeploy Solar Max to orbit. The Solar Maximum satellite project cost has a price tag of about $400 million on it. Right now, there's no return coming back from that big investment. If the shuttle crew can actually fix that satellite, they will have covered the entire cost of both backpacks they have up there, plus the entire cost of this mission. In other words, the shuttle may become what it was designed to be, cost-effective. Chris Peterson, KTRH News at the Johnson Space Center.
Moscow responds to the president's latest foreign policy pronouncement. They're harvesting delegates in Wisconsin, sightseeing in space. Good morning, this is Frank Sedapani with the CBS World News Roundup. Space Shuttle Challenger reported a problem this morning, a mass of smudge marks on Challenger's windows on the world.
Sorry, I'll tell you one thing we need more up here. Roger, what's that? We need some more window cleaner here from all the nose prints on the window looking out.
Peter Van Sant at the Johnson Space Center takes a look at the serious side of today's shuttle activities.
Today's mission involves the release of the heaviest payload ever carried in a shuttle, the 11-ton long-duration exposure facility known as LDEF. LDEF is about the size of a city bus. It's carrying 57 different experiments that will spend more than 10 months rotating the Earth until another shuttle retrieves it. NASA spokesman Keith Henry says LDEF will provide scientists with valuable information about how different substances hold up in space.
To determine what are the long-range effects of certain materials in space due to the extreme heat and cold and ultraviolet radiation, how many of those meteoroids are going to be hitting and what kind of damage they do.
Also on board LDEF will be 13 million tomato seeds. Students across the country will eventually study how the space environment affects seed growth. Peter Van Sant, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Tomorrow, mission specialist George Nelson straps on a rocket backpack to rendezvous with the ailing Solar Max satellite. Nelson will haul it back to Challenger's cargo bay to repair a control system. Since the system failed 3 years ago, that satellite has been unable to study solar flares and other mysteries of the sun. There was a small problem on the shuttle this morning. 2 of the astronauts were supposed to breathe a pure oxygen mixture as part of a medical experiment planned for tomorrow. But problems with 2 valves foiled that. NASA hopes to reschedule the test preparations.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney. An Air Force helicopter has gone down in the Atlantic near Cape Canaveral, Florida. 3 crewmen were rescued, but 5 are missing. Officials say the chopper was flying about 50 miles from the Cape doing surveillance during the test launch of a missile from a new Trident submarine. The crash occurred about 20 minutes after that missile was fired from beneath the surface by the USS Georgia. Cause of the crash isn't known. The helicopter crewmen are members of the 15th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Service at Patrick Air Force Base. Space Shuttle Challenger was launched from the Cape just a little more than 24 hours ago. This morning the flight is going well, except for one minor glitch. Chris Peterson of KTRH Houston reports from Mission Control.
NASA terms it as more of an inconvenience than a problem. Astronauts Nelson and Van Hoften were scheduled to breathe pure oxygen while wearing their launch helmets for about an hour this morning, while the other crewmen lowered the air pressure in Challenger's cabin. But a valve on those helmets was not in the right place, negating any of the effects the breathing test would have had. Mission Control has decided to have the crew simply repeat the procedure. NASA says the only possible problem repeating the breathing exercise can have is the consumption of crew time. Meanwhile, mission specialist Terry Hart has begun work on deploying the huge long-duration exposure satellite. The 22,000-pound facility will be placed in orbit by the mechanical arm, where it will stay for roughly a year. Another shuttle crew will pick it up and fly it home for analysis. Chris Peterson for CBS News, Houston.
CBS News, this is Frank Sedapani. Former Challenger are about an hour and a half away from the first big task of their 6 days in space. They'll be using the craft's 50-foot-long mechanical arm to lift an experiment-laden satellite out of the cargo bay and set it loose in orbit. The satellite is an enormous filing cabinet of scientific probes. It's to remain in orbit until it's picked up by another shuttle next February.
CBS News, this is Rob Armstrong. The Space Shuttle Challenger is about to make a little history. The story from Chris Peterson of CBS radio affiliate KTRH in Houston.
Terry Hart is about 20 minutes from deploying the long-duration exposure facility, nicknamed LDEF. Hart is hoisting the 22,000-pound powerless satellite out of Challenger's payload bay with a 50-foot mechanical arm. He'll then raise it overhead and over the left side of the shuttle, making sure the arm is absolutely still before releasing the LDEF. That's important because if there's any motion on the robot arm at all, it would cause a slight spin on the satellite, making it difficult for it to complete its scheduled year-long stay in space. There are 57 experiments in the LDEF, all being exposed to the no-air, no-gravity environment of space for an extended period. A crew from a future shuttle mission is scheduled to retrieve the LDEF and bring it home in the orbiter payload bay. Tomorrow, Commander Bob Crippen will complete the rendezvous with that crippled Solar Max satellite. Mission specialist George Nelson and Jim Van Hoften will then fly the backpacks during a spacewalk to begin repairing the spacecraft. Chris Peterson for CBS News, Houston.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause. Making deft use of the huge space crane, a Challenger astronaut today launched an 11-ton satellite into orbit. Peter Van Sant of the Johnson Space Center in Houston monitored the experiment.
Challenger Houston through Hawaii for 10 minutes. We're getting pictures, and I think I copied deployed and backing away.
It was as steady as a rocket roller and just about as big.
The long-duration exposure facility known as LDEF was gently released into its free-flying orbit by the shuttle's 50-foot-long manipulator arm. LDEF is about the size of a city bus. It contains 57 experiments, many of them testing materials that may one day be used to construct the first U.S. permanent space station. LDEF is the largest structure ever carried by a shuttle, weighing nearly 11 tons. The giant orbiting laboratory will be picked up by another shuttle in about 10 months and returned to Earth for study. The release of LDEF was the shuttle's major mission today. Tomorrow, astronaut George Nelson will leave the shuttle to intercept the damaged satellite Solar Max and begin the 2 days of repair work. Peter Van Sant, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Have been chasing the Solar Maximum satellite since liftoff. They'll rendezvous with the $400 million spacecraft tomorrow to begin repair efforts on it. Nearly an hour ago, mission specialist Terry Hart successfully placed that large experiment satellite in orbit using the mechanical arm. Now it's about 2 hours of cleanup activities and last-minute chores before going to sleep. Sunday, an early wake-up to get ready for the first of 2 spacewalks as Pinky Nelson and Ox Van Hoften fly the jet-propelled backpacks to rescue Solar Max. Chris Peterson, KTRH News at the Johnson Space Center.
CBS News, this is Mitchell Krause.
Houston through Hawaii for 10 minutes. We're getting pictures, and I think I copied deployed and backing away.
It's going away there, Jer, and it was as steady as a rocket roller and just about as big.
Now it's about 2 hours of cleanup activities and last-minute chores before going to sleep. Tomorrow, an early wake-up to get ready for 2 spacewalks as George Nelson and James Van Hoften fly the jet-propelled backpacks to rescue Solar Max.
CBS News, this is Bob Schieffer. Manipulating a huge robot arm, Challenger astronaut Terry Hart today launched a 10-ton satellite into orbit. Peter Van Sant picks up the story at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Challenger Houston through Hawaii for 10 minutes. We're getting pictures, and I think I copied deployed and backing away. It was the moment a space laboratory the size of a school bus was released into space. The shuttle crew, continuing its perfect mission record, was pleased.
It's all the way there, Jer, and it was as steady as a rocket of water and just about as big.
The laboratory is the long-duration exposure facility called LDEF. LDEF contains 57 different experiments. Most involve materials that may one day be used in the construction of a permanent space station. Scientists want to know how certain substances hold up in the harsh space environment. LDEF will remain in orbit about 10.5 months. Another shuttle will pick it up next year and return it to Earth for study. Tomorrow, the dramatic portion of the mission begins as the shuttle crew captures and begins repairing the damaged satellite SolarMax. Peter Van Sant, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center, Houston.
CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski. Astronaut crew sent a smorgasbord of experiments into space today to test the effects of meteorites, cosmic rays, and the like. If all goes well, another crew will retrieve the experiments 10 months from now. The astronauts are closing in on the ailing SolarMax satellite they intend to repair tomorrow. It's to be pulled into the craft by man and robot arm. Crew member George Nelson will use a rocket-powered backpack to scoot over to the satellite and stop its slow spin by firing his gas jets in the opposite direction. I'm Carol Pazewski, CBS News. CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski. The Shuttle Challenger's 5-man crew is preparing to close in on the SolarMax satellite for an in-space repair job, the day's big project and a primary task of the current shuttle mission. The Challenger will fly in formation with SolarMax, the two just 200 feet apart. Astronaut George Nelson will zoom over to it with his rocket-powered backpack, attach himself to it, and fire his nitrogen gas jets in the opposite direction to slow down its spin. Then SolarMax will be pulled into the orbiting repair shop for a fix-up. Its guidance system broke down in space 10 years ago. More news after this.
Mutual News via satellite. I'm Dave Chester. With that music blaring over the radio, astronaut James Van Hoften was awakened about an hour ago to the strains of the fight song of his alma mater, the University of California at Berkeley. He and his 4 fellow astronauts are now preparing for their big job for Sunday on board the Shuttle Challenger. They'll be snaring and repairing the broken satellite SolarMax. In orbit, the shuttle crew, one member outside rocketing around with a backpack, will maneuver SolarMax into the Challenger's cargo bay. If it can't be fixed, the multi-million-dollar SolarMax will be brought back to Earth when the shuttle's 6-day mission is complete.
CBS News, I'm Carol Pazewski.
Challenger Houston, SolarMax is ready for a rendezvous. All right, so are we.
You just heard the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger telling ground control that it's ready to begin the final phase of its rendezvous with the disabled SolarMax satellite, the prime mission of this Challenger voyage. In about an hour, astronauts Nelson and Van Hoften don their pressure suits and prepare to reel in the satellite for 6 hours of repairs. Nelson, with a gas-powered backpack, maneuvers to the SolarMax 200 feet away. He stabilizes it as the shuttle moves close enough to grab it with a robot arm. If all goes well, the repairs on the satellite, whose guidance system failed several years ago, will then begin. More news after this.
The Johnson Space Center in Houston.
Live conversations between the astronauts and ground control are brought to you through dial-a-shuttle, a service of AT&T Communications, your long-distance phone company. To find out what is available on 900 today, call information number 900-555-1212. There is no charge for this information call.
And good morning. You have reached dial-a-shuttle. We are waiting right now on an ignition burn, which will happen in approximately 35 seconds. That'll be coming up shortly. That will be a nominal height burn, which will take Challenger to a higher orbit, and that will put it in much closer with SolarMax. And that will be happening shortly, approximately 19 seconds. should have happened. At this, our 30th orbit of the Spaceship Challenger, fifth mission. This is the STS-41. We should be entering the Teeter satellite region, and we'll have probably a live conversation from the ship Challenger in approximately 7 minutes. Challenger, by now, should be a little closer to the Solar Max satellite. Right at the moment, we should be 267 apogee, 258 nautical miles perigee. And we're going to get a little update here on the 1984 shuttle missions that will be upcoming.
Flight of mission 41C is the 11th flight in the Space Shuttle program.
Will be locked onto the cradle remotely by astronaut Hart, who will engage two umbilicals which provide electrical power from the shuttle to the Solar Max. In the meantime, Nelson will remove the 338-pound mass.
Challenger, Houston, with you on Tetris. That is Houston trying to make contact with the Challenger. It has just crossed into the Tetris acquisitional line, which is midway in the Pacific Ocean between Australia and South America. This is the 30th orbit of Challenger, STS-41C. We just completed a nominal height adjustment burn 8 minutes 35 seconds ago. This the first day, 20th hour, 22nd minute into mission elapsed time. We're waiting right now for a response from Challenger as it enters the Tetris satellite. Challenger, Houston, with you on Tetris. Our dial-a-shuttle team was flown in by American Airlines, America's leading airline. We're waiting for a response from Challenger, which is crossed over the Tetris boundary line, mid-Pacific Ocean. This is its 30th orbit. And today should be a flurry of activity involving Solar Max. Challenger, Houston, radio check on Tetris. Challenger Houston initiated several calls, but apparently Challenger is not quite within range, Tetris being the tracking and satellite. And we're waiting right now for a reply from that. We'll get back to Pat Jones' tape here right now.
And join astronaut James Van Hoften, who will also be conducting extravehicular activity and who has remained tethered to the shuttle during Nelson's excursion out to Solar Max. In the cradle, the Solar Maximum Observatory will be tilted forward 25 degrees, so its solar arrays will clear the orbiter tail as it is rotated and will provide better access to the attitude control system module. Nelson and Van Hoften will then position themselves to begin replacement of the faulty control system module. To keep from floating away, Van Hoften will secure his feet on a platform called the Manipulator Foot Restraint, or MFR in Nasserese, attached to the end of the orbiter's mechanical arm. Nelson will be secured below on a portable foot restraint, or PFR. Using a device known as the Module Service Tool, Van Hoften will unscrew two retention bolts, remove the module, and replace it with a spare module, which will have been fastened to the lower portion of the flight support system.
Challenger, you reading this yet through Tetris? Challenger, Houston, you're loud and clear now. That was the first one I'd heard.
Okay, we've been reading you all the time, guy, but you've been unable to hear us. Brinko, initial test on the man was just like we were getting the other day with the LDEF. We got all three, so we're running it again.
Roger, copy. And how does the burn go?
Well, with nominal no time.
module is expected to take 45 minutes. Then the more difficult task of replacing the main electronics box on the coronagraph parameter will begin. It is a more difficult task because the spacesuit gloves are bulky and the exchange requires working with scissors and small screws. During this extravehicular activity, Van Hoften will pull back some thermal protection and install a hinge so that the panel on the main electronics box can be opened like a door.
Greatest challenge facing the airline.
CBS News, I'm Bill Whitney. Nelson and James Van Hoften should start putting on their pressure suits a few minutes from now, getting ready to become servicemen who make space calls. Challenger is maneuvering closer to Solar Max, the research satellite that needs repairs. When the two craft are within 200 feet, Nelson and Van Hoften will venture out with backpacks to take hold of Solar Max and guide it into the shuttle's cargo bay. There, they'll replace some defective parts and prepare for another repair work on Tuesday.
CBS News, this is Rob Armstrong. Two of the Space Shuttle Challenger's 5 crew members are getting ready to leave the shuttle and retrieve a disabled satellite. The plan is to take the broken satellite aboard the shuttle, fix it, and put it back into orbit, a series of firsts for the shuttle program, all of which could have long-term impact on the future manufacture and deployment of satellites. The serious business of the mission is not without its lighter moments. Take, for example, this exchange between the crew and the ground.
Last crew had Buck and Flash, and we've got Mo, Larry, and Curly. We concur.
Shuttle Commander Robert Crippen right now is maneuvering Challenger within 200 yards of the broken satellite. The spacewalk itself is to begin in about 2.5 hours. More news in a minute.
CBS News, I'm Neil Strasser. The patient is now in sight of the shuttle astronauts this morning as they prepare for the first shuttle house call on an ailing satellite. We hear the latest from Doug Miller of CBS radio affiliate KTRH at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
The long chase in space is finally nearing its end. Challenger is now roughly 7 nautical miles away from the broken Solar Max satellite. That's the $77 million bird that the shuttle astronauts hope to rescue and repair later this morning. Astronauts George feet over to that spinning satellite. He'll have to stabilize the Solar Max before it can be grabbed by the shuttle's robot arm and tucked into Challenger's cargo bay. Today marks the most important milestone in this 6-day flight. NASA hopes it will open a new era, the era of service calls in space. Doug Miller for CBS News, the Johnson Space Center.
Well, we're having some difficulty getting Doug right now. We'll try to get him a little later for you later on this morning.
Is now closing in fast, and a crippled satellite is now listening to radio commands from the shuttle itself. The satellite, called Solar Max, this nation's only sun observatory in orbit, is spinning at a rate of about 1 full turn every 6 minutes. Now instruments mounted inside the shuttle's cargo bay must tell the busted bird to turn off its rocket control systems. The 2 astronauts set for the first garage job in space are now hanging in the weightlessness of the shuttle's airlock. About 15 minutes from now, they're supposed to begin the pre-breathing of pure oxygen that's supposed to prevent the sort of bends experienced by deep-sea divers. Well, before they don their spacesuits, they beam back TV pictures of themselves horsing around, playing catch with a roll of duct tape in the weightlessness of space.
We've got through some of Newton's laws, I think. Last crew had Buck and Flash, and we've got Mo, Larry, and Curly. Obviously, they're ready if all they got to do is play catch.
About an hour and 5 minutes from now, astronauts George Nelson and James Van Hoften are scheduled to crawl out of Challenger's airlock and into the vacuum of the shuttle's cargo bay. Nelson must slip into one of the jet backpacks and fly about 100 yards over to that broken satellite. He's supposed to stabilize that slow spin so that Solar Max can be grabbed by the Challenger's robot arm. That arm's going to carefully tuck the satellite into a custom-built cradle inside the payload bay. Today, the big task is to replace a broken attitude control system system on that bird. It's the most crucial job of all if the $77 million Solar Max satellite is to be saved. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.
Mutual News via satellite. I'm Robert Burns. The Space Shuttle astronauts are closing in at this hour on the Solar Max satellite. Astronauts George Nelson and James Van Hoften are now in the cargo bay. They're planning to approach that satellite via a jet backpack and attempt to hook it to the shuttle's 50-foot crane so it can be taken into Challenger's cargo bay for repairs. Mutual's Jim Slade reports the cost of repairing the satellite is considerably less than buying a new one.
The Solar Maximum satellite, if it had to be replaced on today's market, would be about $235 million. This repair mission, as it's lined out with the operations on orbit and the equipment that had to be built specially to do it, which can be used on future missions, is coming in at about $48 million. So you can see it was cheaper to fix it than to throw it away.
Space mechanics are now outside, and their busted machine is waiting just a few hundred feet away, so close that astronauts George Pinky Nelson and James Ox Van Hoften just a few minutes ago caught their first glimpse of the crippled Solar Max satellite. Their comment, very simple.
There's a satellite out there.
That's the satellite they must fix a few minutes from now. Challenger is now about 300 feet away from Solar Max, closing in at a range of about 4 inches per second. Now, Mission Control is watching the big bird on television, or has been throughout the morning. The shuttle's instruments have been shutting down the broken satellite's attitude control system. It's confirmed that process is now complete. That's going to help stabilize the slowly spinning bird, but the job of stopping it dead in its orbit will fall to astronaut Nelson, who is now checking out his jet-powered backpack for what promises to be the most spectacular space feat of the entire shuttle program. Live at the Johnson Space Center, Doug Miller, KTRH News.